Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise and get straight to the essential knowledge you need.
Today, we are taking an exhaustive look at a country that is, well, it's often hailed as the African miracle.
And rightly so, we're talking about Botswana.
It's just an extraordinary historical case study, and frankly, a necessary corrective to a lot of the common narratives about post-colonial Africa.
A necessary corrective, yeah. I mean, you're looking at one of the world's most stable, long-standing multi-party democracies.
And one that's used its resource wealth, specifically diamonds, to power decades of sustained rapid economic growth.
Which is so rare. That kind of success, just doesn't happen by accident.
Not at all. It's built on layers of really surprising colonial history, a powerful traditional culture that somehow managed to integrate itself into modern governance.
And a political pragmatism that just, very few other nations managed to achieve.
And we really have to start by grounding ourselves in the incredible initial hurdle they faced. Because at independence in 1966, this nation, then the Bechuanaland Protectorate, was in catastrophic shape.
Catastrophic is the right word. It was genuinely one of the world's 25 poorest nations. I mean, the statistics, they almost don't sound real today.
They really don't.
You're talking about a GDP per capita of only about $70.
$70 and the infrastructure.
I saw a figure something like 12 kilometers of paved road.
12 in the entire country.
And maybe the most symbolic detail of all, the one that really tells the story, is that they had just 22 university graduates ready to staff an entire new government.
22. And the capital city, Mafeking, wasn't even inside their own borders.
It was in apartheid South Africa. I mean, can you imagine trying to build a modern state when your own ministers are struggling to get visas just to go to cabinet meetings?
It's unthinkable. And yet, within a few decades, Botswana manages this incredible transformation into an upper-middle income country. All through just exceptionally shrewd political and economic choices.
So our mission today is to really unpack that journey. We're using academic sources on the Protectorate, deep dives into modern governance reports.
We want to show you exactly how that foundation was laid, and it all starts with the very reluctant, very strategic creation of the Bechuanaland Protectorate itself.
So let's start there. The story begins in 1885. But this isn't a story of Britain suddenly feeling some strong affinity for the Botswana people, is it?
Not in the slightest. No, this was a classic imperial move. It was driven entirely by geopolitical anxiety.
Okay, so what was the immediate pressing danger? Why did Britain feel the need to occupy southern Botswana and just, unilaterally declare this protectorate?
The urgency was really twofold. Primarily, they absolutely had to safeguard what they called the road to the north.
The road to the north?
Yes. This was the vital overland route that linked the Cape Colony to all of its territories, and, more importantly, its ambitious mining claims further north, in what would eventually become Russia.
So allowing that road to be cut off would have been disastrous for their whole imperial vision.
Absolutely disastrous.
Then who was threatening to cut it off? Who are the rivals here?
Well, they were facing expansionist pressure from two major fronts. You had the German Empire, which was busy consolidating its hold on German Southwest Africa. That's modern Namibia. And then, perhaps even more dangerously, you had the white settler states. So the aggressive Boers of the Transvaal Republic and, crucially, the massive expansionist ambitions of Cecil Rhodes and his British South Africa Company.
The Beko.
Exactly. So for Britain, establishing this protectorate was a defensive act. It was about creating a clear border and preventing themselves from being boxed in by their rivals.
So the Bechuanaland Protectorate was less a project of colonial development and more like a piece of imperial plumbing.
A strategic buffer zone. That's exactly what it was.
And that context really explains the name, doesn't it? The choice of protectorate over colony.
Precisely. The British were very, very careful with their language here. The name Protectorate was an immediate attempt to reassure the local Botswana people and their rulers, the Degosi, that their status was different.
The implication being they'd retain some autonomy.
That was the promise. Yeah, that they weren't just being annexed outright like a traditional colony.
But the Degosi, the traditional rulers, they weren't just passive observers in all this. Their initial stance was actually pretty strong resistance.
Oh, absolutely.
So how did they go from resisting the British presence to actively, favoring it as a strategic tool?
It came down to a political calculation, a classic case of choosing the lesser evil. The Desi were keenly aware of the threats they faced.
They could see the writing on the wall.
They could. While the British Crown was, distant and often indifferent, the white settler regimes in South Africa and Rhodesia were rapacious. They posed an existential threat to their land, to their sovereignty. Settler control meant immediate loss of territory, and the imposition of just brutal labor laws.
So the British Crown, for all its faults, was a much better option than Cecil Rhodes.
A much, much better option. By around 1910, this strategic consensus had really hardened. The Degosi fundamentally redefined the idea of the protectorate. It wasn't an imposition anymore.
It was a shield.
It was an imperial shield. And that shield was explicitly intended to prevent them from being absorbed by those hostile white settler states right on their borders. It was a conscious defensive choice made by the Botswana leadership.
Which makes that early resistance all the more fascinating. If they later embraced the shield idea, what did that initial opposition actually look like?
Well, it was robust and it was organized. You see this most clearly at the Kupong Conference in February of 1989. The main Sodhamsi, we're talking Berthing I, Lynchway and Seller I, they all met and presented a united front. They opposed the continued British military presence, and they explicitly stated they wanted independence.
They were very clear.
Very. Lynchway of the Bakala is quoted as saying, "I do not wish either the Boers or the English to come and take our chieftainship away from us." They knew that protection very often led to annexation.
But history really turned on the decision of one powerful leader who broke ranks.
That's right. That was Kagositatu of the Bengto. A massive kingdom, up in the north. Khama decided to cooperate. He promised to assist the British government.
Which must have been a huge political gamble.
It was. It alienated him from his peers who saw him with a lot of suspicion. But it was a long-term strategic play to secure his territory against all those external threats, particularly the Boer.
And that strategic alliance really set the stage for probably the most famous piece of Botswana diplomacy in the entire colonial period.
The crucial 1895 mission to London.
It was a true diplomatic masterstroke.
Khama, along with Sally the Fist and Bathe on the Fist, they made the voyage to London. And the urgency here just can't be overstated.
Why? What was the immediate threat?
They were there to petition Queen Victoria to block the transfer of the entire protectorate to Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company. Rhodes saw their territory as nothing more than an obstacle in his grand dream of an empire stretching from the Cape to Cairo.
So they weren't just fighting a state, they were fighting a multinational corporation with its own private army.
Exactly.
And they managed to win. How on earth did they pull off that kind of political and public relations coup?
Well, they leveraged very powerful moral and religious allies. The mission was organized with key support from the London Missionary Society, the LMS.
Oh.
And this demonstrates a classic political tactic. They used some foreigners, the LMS missionaries, who had decades of trusted relationships with the chiefs, to help them negotiate with other more troublesome foreigners, like the colonial administration and Rhodes.
They appealed directly to the British public sense of fairness and moral obligation.
They did.
And the result of all this high-stakes lobbying?
A huge success, but a partial one.
A monumental, if partial success, yes.
The colonial secretary Joseph Chamberlain, he eventually agreed that the core territories of the three chiefs who made the trip, the Gengwazi, the Gengwato and the Quining, would remain under the protection of the Crown.
explicitly blocking roads from an immediate takeover.
Right. It ensured their land rights and their traditional leadership structure would survive.
But you said partial success. So what part of the country did they lose?
And that's the painful detail that often gets overlooked in the celebration. While those three chiefs secured their homelands, other areas including the Bale, the Bakala and the Barolong territories were transferred to the Beko.
AS installments.
AS installments for railway concessions and other economic interests. So the victory wasn't universal. But still, the return of Kaprama, Sabela and Batho was rightly celebrated back home as a major triumph. They had stopped the complete annexation by roads.
And Khama's acceptance of this protection, it came with very specific conditions. It wasn't a blanket surrender. It was a negotiation.
He was extremely savvy about protecting his people's sovereignty and their culture. He laid down two major non-negotiable laws that he demanded the British uphold.
What were they?
First, he was deeply committed to moral and social order. So he insisted that the law against intoxicating drinks must be upheld for both black and white people in his territory.
Which was a direct challenge to the often corrupt practices of settler traders.
A direct challenge. And the second point was all about economic security.
Land.
Exactly. He demanded that the lands of the Bamwado were fundamentally not saleable. This was the ultimate safeguard against settler encroachment. It ensured that land tenure remained under the control of the Besi, for the benefit of the community, not for individual profit or, transfer to white farmers.
And he even offered the British large tracts of land, right, as a way to avoid taxation.
A very clever move. He hoped this land grant would exempt his people from having to pay taxes to the British administration entirely. This early fiscal maneuvering just shows a foundational mistrust of colonial economics.
That deep-seated concern over land, culture and taxation. It defined the next era. But as we move on, the reality of British protection started to show its ugly side very quickly.
Yeah, that's where we get into the fundamental legal paradox for the protected people.
Because the promise of the imperial shield, as nice as it sounded, was one thing, the reality was another.
The reality was extensive colonial interference. Britain drew lines on the map. They demarcated the original 7, later 9 tribal reserves in Mojanane Tisatisa, but they insisted that their authority over all the remaining land, the crown lands, and freehold farms, was absolute.
So the British High Commissioner essentially reserved the right to legislate by proclamation over the entire territory.
Regardless of what the Degosi thought. Yes.
So the local rulers were shielded from the settlers, but completely exposed and defenseless against the protecting power itself.
That's it. And this is where the legal concept of the protected person becomes so critical and so devastating.
Let's talk about the Segoma Lechobi case. This is sometimes called Botswana's Black Dreyfus. Why was this ruling so foundational for the colonial administration?
This case from 1906 to 1912 is the ultimate illustration of that paradox. Sikobi was the Bawa ruler, and he got caught up in some internal disputes over the Besi, the chieftainship.
Okay.
The British administration, suspicious that he was going to cause civil unrest, decided to just detain him without trial. At Gaone, they literally locked him up indefinitely based on a suspicion.
Which is a direct violation of a core pillar of English common law, the principle of habeas corpus.
Absolutely. And the IS lawyers recognized this fundamental legal violation, so they launched this spectacular challenge, arguing his detention was illegal under English law and demanding he be brought to court or released.
And the case goes to the imperial courts, and they have to decide. Does Semana, as a protected person, have the same rights as a British subject?
And the ruling was decisive. And it was chilling. The courts ruled that Seya was not a crown subject. He was a British protected person.
And
Therefore, he had no legal standing in the metropolitan courts to appeal the High Commissioner's decision.
Wow.
That legal distinction was a masterstroke for the colonial power. It meant the British Crown could exercise absolute authority over the Protectorate without any domestic legal restraint. The High Commissioner could rule by proclamation, detain without trial.
He was essentially above the law.
As far as the local population was concerned, yes.
That's truly chilling. I mean, the people accept protection to get security from the settlers, only to find out that that very protection legally strips them of their basic rights against the protector. It sounds like a formula for political instability.
It should have been. And yet, Botswana remained relatively stable.
Oh, what held it together?
Because while the High Commissioner was issuing these arbitrary proclamations from above, the Botswana people were relying on a traditional system of governance and law that the British, for all their interference, could never fully erase the Kalala.
Okay, let's elaborate on the last system, because it's so much more than just a court, right? It's really the philosophical heart of Tswana political life.
It is the ultimate expression of the Tswana democratic tradition. The Kalala is everything. It's the central meeting point. It's the community council for policy discussion. It's the local administrative body. And it's the judicial chamber.
And it all embodies that core philosophy.
Vesi, Keskabato.
Which means, a chief is a chief by the will of the people.
It means that leadership is conditional, it's consultative, it's not absolute.
And what does that consultative process actually look like in practice? How does it compare to, say, a Western judicial or legislative style?
Well, it's defined by consensus. And really candid feedback. In the Kalala, everyone who has an opinion is not just allowed to speak, they're expected to speak. And often the chief himself will hold his own counsel until the people have fully expressed their views.
So it's designed to maximize public input.
To maximize input and build consensus, so that when a decision is finally made, it carries the maximum possible legitimacy within that community.
And this resilient system, it maintained its judicial power even under the Protectorate.
Absolutely. The British might have appointed their magistrates and established their own courts. But for the vast majority of the population, Vesi and the traditional customary courts remained the primary legal forum.
And the persistence of this tradition is just remarkable.
It's staggering. I mean, even today, customary courts settle somewhere between 75 and 80% of all civil and minor criminal cases in Botswana. Sievigala was and it still is the anchor of justice and local governance.
And that stability proved absolutely essential when the next big threat of incorporation loomed. The period between 1907 and 1909. This was defined by the coordinated fight against being transferred to the new Union of South Africa.
That fight was nation-building in real time. The British government, always looking to cut costs and simplify administration, repeatedly tried to transfer control of Bechuanaland, Buland and Swaziland to the new Whittled Union of South Africa.
But the Bena leaders, they learned from that 1995 mission. They knew how to leverage the moral argument and public opinion.
They did. They coordinated their efforts brilliantly. They appealed directly to that original promise of protection the British had made, that the shield was supposed to be against settler control.
So they used petitions, diplomatic channels,
appeal over the heads of the colonial authorities, urging the British public not to betray them by handing them over to the Boers, who were at that very moment actively institutionalizing racial segregation.
And in defining what they didn't want to be, they started to define what they were.
Precisely. This resistance to being incorporated, it helped establish this idea among the various tribes and communities, that they belong to a common nation, a nation that must exist independently, outside the jurisdiction of South Africa.
It's a crucial unifying political identity. And it was forged decades before independence,
laying the groundwork for the future BDP motto of unity.
It's a powerful lesson, isn't it? Political unity often crystallizes most effectively when you're facing a common immediate external threat.
But when independence finally did arrive in 1966, that newly unified nation inherited a state that was, materially speaking, a complete disaster.
The transition from Protectorate to the Republic of Botswana, in 1966, was not some joyous arrival into prosperity. It was an urgent race against economic and infrastructural collapse.
And we really have to underscore that starting point again. We mentioned the GDP per capita, comparable to the poorest regions in the world today.
And the institutional paralysis. You mentioned the graduates, but think about it. Maybe 100 people in the entire country, with a full secondary education. That is not a civil service.
That's barely a high school reunion.
The total lack of preparation is just astounding.
It says everything about the utter neglect under the Protectorate. The British established the first government secondary school only the year before independence, and even establishing the new capital Ghana was a rush job in 1965, because the administration had to move out of Mafikeng. It was politically untenable.
So given that complete vacuum, how did the newly formed government, led by the Botswana Democratic Party, the BDP, how did they establish control and direction so quickly and so effectively?
The BDP, which was founded in 1962, immediately defined itself as a moderate conservative party. It was committed to liberal democracy and the rule of law. And its key founding figures, Khama and Kwaya, were deeply pragmatic men.
And their core strategy wasn't revolution.
No, it was accelerated stable development.
In the choice they made about the bureaucracy, it stands in such stark contrast to so many other newly independent African nations that embraced this kind of radical nationalism and rapidization.
That was the foundational choice that secured their future stability. Kamamita and Messier, they resisted the pressure for immediate wholesale replacement of foreign staff. They knew that hasty expulsion of skilled administrators and technicians had led to chaos, corruption, and economic collapse elsewhere.
So instead of going for that immediate political gratification, they chose meritocracy.
Precisely. The BDP strategy was to maintain the necessary foreign expatriates, often British or South African, until genuinely qualified merit-based local replacements were ready to take over.
It was a political risk, but it meant they preserved a functional Western-style technocratic bureaucracy.
A bureaucracy focused solely on efficiency and development, rather than on patronage. And it meant that when the diamond revenue eventually came, they had the structures in place to manage it professionally.
In this philosophy, it needed a national framework. Let's talk about the 4 national principles they adopted in the 1960, because these were explicitly designed to counteract that colonial experience.
Right. These principles, democracy, development, unity, and self-reliance, they were more than just slogans. They were the operating system for the new republic.
Let's break them down. Democracy
was the response to the High Commissioner's arbitrary rule. Development was the response to decades of colonial neglect.
All for alliance
was the response to being financially dependent on the UK, which they were until 1972. And unity was the direct response to colonial policies that had always emphasized tribal differences.
Unity in particular was the mechanism that addressed all those linguistic and ethnic cleavages. But how did they institutionalize the most important cultural tradition of all? The consultation into the mechanism of a modern state.
This is the secret sauce. This is the part of the story that's so crucial. The BDP didn't just pay lip service to the gala. They made it the engine of policy legitimacy, especially in the crucial area of budgetary allocation.
So how did they formally integrate that traditional feedback loop into national budgeting?
The government's leadership, Kauprolam and Meyer, they made traveling and listening a core part of their mandate. They launched these massive nationwide consultative tours using the Kagala Forum in every major village and town across the country.
And this wasn't just electioneering.
No, this was governance. This was how they governed.
What specific influence did that feedback actually have? Did they listen?
They absolutely listened. It ensured the government respected public priorities. In the early years, the government would consult on the draft budget and the National Development Plan. And the common refrain from the people, articulated so candidly in the gala, wasn't for grand projects.
They wanted the basics.
They wanted the basics. clean water provision, primary education facilities, basic healthcare clinics, and improved roads. And the government, respecting that feedback, adjusted the budget allocations accordingly, pooling resources immediately into rural development.
So because the government took that feedback seriously and actually delivered on those priorities, they built immediate and overwhelming legitimacy, especially in the rural areas.
Exactly. That responsiveness cemented their electoral dominance for decades to come. They created a feedback loop, provisional consultation, provided legitimacy, which led to stable government, which allowed for prudent technocratic management,
which ensured that when the diamonds hit, they were prepared to manage the windfall responsibly.
They had built social capital before they ever built financial capital.
And speaking of that windfall, this is where we move from the institution building to the dramatic economic transformation driven by mineral wealth, and of course its inherent double edges.
I mean, the timing of the resource discovery was just phenomenal. Com's government secures independence in 1966. The very next year, 1967, the Orapa diamond pipe is discovered.
The second largest in the world.
The second largest kimberlite pipe in the world.
Oh.
Then in 1992, the massive mine is found, which very quickly becomes the richest diamond mine in the world by value.
That sudden injection of wealth is so incredibly rare, especially into a system that had already prioritized prudent governance. It allowed for an immediate and unprecedented economic acceleration.
It truly did. Botswana became the poster child for resource-led success. It shifted from absolute poverty to an upper-middle-income country status. For a full decade between 1977 and 1987, the nation achieved an average annual GDP growth rate of 12%.
12%. That level of sustained growth is almost unheard of in economic history.
It is litany. But history is just littered with examples of resource wealth leading directly to corruption, conflict, instability, the so-called resource curse. So, how did Botswana strategically manage this massive influx to avoid that trap?
The key was control. Control over the terms of extraction. Unlike so many other nations that sold off their concessions cheaply, Khama's administration negotiated ruthlessly. The government partnered with the global giant De Beers, forming the Debana joint venture in 1978.
Okay, let's dig into the details of that joint venture. What specific mechanisms did they put in place to make sure the majority of the value actually stayed in Botswana?
Well, it was a layered financial structure. It wasn't just a simple royalty payment. The Botswana government secured a 50% equity share in DEB itself.
50%.
50%. On top of that, they applied robust taxation and royalty frameworks that were deliberately designed to maximize state revenue, without choking off the necessary foreign investment. When you combine the dividends from their equity, the royalties, and the corporate tax, the Botswana government consistently received over 75% of the total profits generated by the mines.
75% of the profits. That is a staggering figure, particularly for that era where profit splits of 25 or the 30% were common in other resource-rich states.
It was hapo siezi shalitan. It shows a profound commitment to self-reliance and just incredibly shrewd negotiation.
And that really speaks to the technocratic bureaucracy they'd protected.
It was the ultimate expression of it. They used international consultants, often the same ones used by major Western governments, to level the playing field during their negotiations with Beers.
They are focused on ensuring the resource was managed for the benefit of the nation, not just for a small elite.
And beyond the mining sector itself, the government also focused on diversification and fiscal prudence. What were the long-term tools they used to safeguard that wealth?
They realized that resource wealth is finite and it's volatile. So they established their own currency, the pula, which means rain in 1976.
Symbolizing prosperity.
And life, yes. They also focused on these rigorous long-term national development plans that mapped out spending 5 years in advance. And crucially, they developed massive foreign currency contingency reserves to weather droughts and global recessions.
Which is a direct application of the Kagala's traditional emphasis on planning for lean times.
Exactly. And the non-mining economy also grew rapidly, averaging over 10% annually, which shows the money wasn't just sitting in bank accounts, it was being responsibly reinvested.
And their relationship with foreign aid was equally pragmatic.
Highly pragmatic. For a time, Botswana received the highest flow of foreign aid per capita in all of Africa. But the key difference was that Botswana dictated the terms. They made sure that donor priorities always align with the government's own national development plan objectives.
So they treated donor agencies as partners, not supervisors.
They maintained their autonomy and that principle of self-reliance, even while they were accepting assistance.
This sounds like a narrative of almost unbroken success. And yet, the sources are very clear that despite this African miracle status, deep socio-economic challenges persist. What is the double edge of the diamond economy?
The starkest reality is the deep and persistent inequality. Botswana is ranked as one of the world's most unequal societies, measured by a very high Gini index score of 53.3.
What does the Gini score actually translate to on the ground? Where is that inequality most visible?
Well, it translates into a major disparity between urban centers and remote rural areas, and between those connected to the professional state machinery and those who are not. While public services like roads and water are widely available, access to quality employment, to capital, to private wealth, it remains highly concentrated. You see pockets of extreme poverty existing right alongside the opulence generated by the mining wealth.
And this leads directly to the ongoing crisis of job creation.
Yes. The heavy reliance on diamond revenue, which is capital-intensive, not labor-intensive, has really hampered diversification into sectors that create mass employment. Youth unemployment is persistently high, hovering around 26%.
Which creates this massive structural challenge. How does a state sustained by mineral revenue satisfy the expectations of a highly educated, rapidly growing youth population?
It's the central question.
And the other great test of their institutional capacity came in the form of the HIV/AIDS crisis, which hit Botswana harder than almost anywhere else on earth. Given their reputation for such meticulous planning, why did the government's response to this national tragedy initially falter?
This crisis, which saw life expectancy plummet from the high 60s down to a low of 49 years by 2002, it exposed a major weakness in that technocratic model.
Which was?
Bureaucratic siloing, and a failure to apply the traditional consultative mechanism to a non-economic problem.
Okay, let's impact that failure.
Yeah. Where did that established policy model break down?
Well, in the mining sector or in drought management, the government used multi-stakeholder consultations. During the initial phase of the AIDS epidemic, the Ministry of Health maintained effective monopoly on policy. So key stakeholders who needed to be involved, the NGOs already working on the ground, traditional leaders who control social messaging in the Kala, labor unions, even other government ministries, they were largely excluded or marginalized.
So that flow of candid feedback, the very thing that made the BDP so strong in the 1960s was severed, because the bureaucracy had become too centralized and too specialized.
Precisely. And policy errors resulted from that exclusion. For instance, public health messaging struggled to reach and resonate with communities because the traditional leaders hadn't been integrated into the campaign design.
And the initial slowness in rolling out the comprehensive RV programs compared to the speed we saw in the mining sector.
It underscored that the consultative policy model, the BDP's secret sauce, was not being consistently applied to non-economic crises.
And while Botswana ultimately deserves immense credit for launching those comprehensive ARV programs and achieving universal access to treatment, a phenomenal national effort, That initial bureaucratic resistance serves as a powerful reminder
that even the most successful systems are only as resilient as their core consultative mechanisms.
Right. And that historical pursuit of unity, while politically necessary back in 1966, also created these deep tensions in the modern era, especially around culture and language.
Yes. And this is where the cracks in the BDP's long hegemony really begin to show.
Let's discuss what the sources call the imperfect tricia. We understand English is the official language and Setswana is the national language. But what's the practical consequence of relegating those other 23 indigenous languages?
The consequence is marginalization, and it leads to language decline, or what academics call death and death. While Setswana serves as that necessary glue for national identity, the policy has meant that these other languages, like Ikalanga or Shigari or Siga, they are not used in government, in business, or most critically in the formal education system.
So if you're a child from a non-speaking home, your access to education and opportunity is immediately complicated by a language policy that was designed for national cohesion.
Absolutely. It creates perceived, if unintentional, discrimination. Although the government's developmental approach has been non-discriminatory, the linguistic policy creates a cultural cleavage. Certain ethnic groups feel excluded from official political and economic domains, perceiving Setswana as the dominant cultural force that stifles their own identity and their language development.
And this tension has fueled a significant cultural renaissance and political activism in recent decades.
It has. We see groups like the Khama Association and the Society for the Promotion of Ikalanga Language engaged in highly active macrolanguage planning. They are demanding that the government recognize Botswana's diversity as a national asset, not as a threat to unity.
And their advocacy is focused on getting these indigenous languages integrated into early basic education,
which would be a monumental shift in national policy.
And at the same time, the traditional institutions that were so central to the nation's founding, they've continued to evolve, often becoming less politically powerful over time.
That was the BDP's long-term strategy all along. Keep the cultural and judicial authority of the chiefs, but remove their political teeth. The House of Chiefs established at independence remains today a purely advisory body.
So they advise Parliament on matters of customary law and culture. But they hold no legislative veto power.
None at all.
And the consultative heart of the nation, the Gala, is also showing signs of stress after decades under a dominant party system.
Yes.
While the BDP government continued to use the Gala for consultation, some governance reports suggest that these engagements could become superficial, especially as the BDP became more and more entrenched.
How so?
Well, there are documented instances of individuals who raised challenging, candid questions about decisions made by the political leadership being silenced or sidelined. This indicates a potential degradation of that crucial candid feedback loop that really defined the Khama era.
So that degradation of the consultative culture, combined with the persistent youth unemployment and inequality, that all set the stage for the dramatic and historic political shift we just witnessed in Mbili. Sifuri Mbili, Ne.
We are talking about the end of an era defined by stability. The Botswana Democratic Party had enjoyed 59 years of continuous unbroken rule from 1966 until November 2024.
That made them the longest continuous ruling party in the democratic world.
They did.
So what finally broke that incredible hegemony?
It seems to have been a highly public, very personal internal fracture at the absolute highest level.
It was an explosion from within. The public and increasingly acrimonious dispute between the former President Ian Karama and the sitting President Masisi Masisi was the key catalyst. Khama eventually quit the BDP in 2019 and formed the Botswana Patriotic Front, the BPF.
And this fracture wasn't just symbolic, it was geographically decisive.
Crucially, yes, Aite. Khama took with him the political support of the Central District, that's his home region, and the traditional territory, which had been the BDP's most reliable decades-long electoral stronghold.
So that internal division just shattered the BDP's electoral map.
It did. But that personal feud wouldn't have been enough on its own, without the underlying economic anxiety we've been discussing. The opposition, the UDC, led by Duma Boko, they effectively channeled the disillusionment over unemployment and inequality.
Right. The UDC's message resonated with a whole generation of voters who didn't remember the poverty of 1966. They only knew the failure of the BDP to translate all that diamond wealth into widespread economic opportunity and diversified jobs.
Exactly. So that fracture combined with the economic fatigue finally opened the door.
And the result was historic. The BDP lost its majority and Duma Boko, leader of the Umbrella for Democratic Change, the UDC, was sworn in as the new president in November 2024. This signals a new era of genuinely competitive multi-party democracy for the country.
And the new administration is clearly focused on moving Botswana beyond its dependence on diamonds. They've outlined a very bold, technologically focused agenda.
What are the key elements of this new diversification push?
Well, they are looking squarely at the knowledge economy and technology integration. Plans have already been announced to engage figures like Elon Musk to extend affordable internet access nationwide through Starlink. They are prioritizing investment in renewable solar energy, recognizing Botswana's vast potential there, and they are moving into high-value agricultural sectors like medicinal cannabis and industrial hemp.
And symbolically, they made a really profound statement about their future direction very early on.
Yes. In March 2025, Botswana launched its first satellite, BOT-21, and this is a very deliberate signal to the world and to its own population. The future is not subterranean wealth. It's technological innovation and a knowledge-based economy.
It's an attempt to reimagine self-reliance for the 21st century.
I think so.
So this deep dive has really shown us that Botswana's transformation from this colonial backwater, facing collapse, to a stable upper-middle-income country, was built on a unique historical foundation.
A unique foundation? Yeah. They used the imperial shield to preserve their traditional authority structure. And then they skillfully blended democratic institutions with that deep Swana tradition of candid consultation encapsulated by the Kala.
And the founders' genius really lay in their political structure. They maintained stability by strategically limiting the political power of the traditional chiefs,
ensuring they remained these judicial and cultural anchors, while vesting ultimate legislative power in the national democratic government. That balance allowed for legitimacy without fragmenting the national political scene.
But that balance was upheld for decades by the dominance of a single pragmatic party that prioritized national unity above all else. And now that hegemony has been definitively ended.
And this is the critical challenge facing the new administration under Duma Boko. Botswana now operates in a genuinely competitive, fractured political environment. The new government must now address the persistent ethnic and linguistic cleavages that the BDP kind of papered over with its unity policy.
All while meeting the increasingly high expectations of the younger generation. The generation that only knows resource-fueled wealth, the diamond children.
Exactly. They expect material well-being, they expect jobs, and they expect diversification. So the ultimate test is whether this newly competitive multi-party landscape can sustain the economic miracle while successfully navigating the political and cultural divisions that have finally broken through.
Can they uphold the core national principles of unity and development in an era where power is no longer guaranteed?
That's the question.
The fascinating test for an exceptional African democracy.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Botswana's long journey, from imperial shield to a new democratic milestone.